Now, as I was saying a little while ago, that I realize very few of you fellows have ever been up over this Chisholm Trail. Some things about it you ought to know. All this trailing cattle north, you know, is a new business. But it's something we've got to get used to because it's going to mean the salvation of Texas. A lot of you fellows I know are ex-Confederate soldiers. You've come back home to Texas. What'd you find? You found cattle all over the countryside. Why, even old man Maverick hasn't branded one in years. Texas is rich in land and cattle. The only thing she hasn't got is money. Now, this Chisholm Trail is going to be the salvation of Texas, as I started to tell you a minute ago. It's all right to have cattle. It's all right to have land. But you've got to sell those cattle in order to maintain the land. And the luckiest thing that's happened to us is that they're beginning to build these railroads out across the western states to the north. All we've got to do is round up our Texas cattle, trail them north, load them on the railroads, and ship them to the eastern markets. Now, you know, the East has had to build up, too, after this war. You've got all those big manufacturing centers back there in the Yankee country. It's all right to work, but they have to eat. And they got to have beef. And we've got the beef. So the Yanks and the Rebs are going to get together. We're going to keep meeting, and they're going to keep us alive. So let's look at it that way. You know, this Chisholm Trail, as I started to say to you a minute ago, was a very fortunate thing. The way it came about was that soon after the war began, the Union government decided that the best thing to do was remove a lot of these Indians, get them out of the way so they wouldn't go on the warpath. So they moved them away up into Kansas, near a place called Caldwell. Now, at the end of the war, just in 1867, just a few years ago, they wanted to move those Indians back down into the Indian Territory, so they hired an old, well, he was a half-breed Cherokee. His name was Jesse Chisholm, and that's how this trail gets its name. Let me show you what he did here. I brought a map along here because we got to figure out where we're going. We've got to know where we are all the time. So what they did from way up here in this Kansas country, around this Caldwell, Kansas, was to hire Jesse Chisholm to build a trail all the way down here around this country near Fort Cobb, so they could trail all those Indians back. Now that meant Indians, squaws, papooses, travois, lodges, all the government troops that are going to escort them down there, all your teamsters with the supplies. Naturally, these rivers, just look here. Here you've got the Washita and the Canadian and the Cimarron, clear down to the Red River. But there are a lot of bad crossings on those rivers. So old Jesse figured the best way to do it was to take about 100 head of Indian ponies. Whenever he hit one of those cut banks, he'd run them off there until he'd knocked it down and really made a place for those wagon trains to go through. So that trail has been built all the way, let's say, from Fort Cobb up here to around Caldwell, Kansas. And that's where we're going with these critters. We're going to follow that trail. Now, you see, down here in Texas, we've got a lot of feeder trails now that come in here. Then we cross the Red River. We just come to the east of Fort Cobb. We hit that Chisholm Trail and carry on up north, clear on up here to Abilene. Now, you see, that's where that railroad is building. Kansas Pacific is building across from Kansas City. They say they're going all the way to Denver. That's out in Colorado. But right now, the town that we're interested in is this town of Abilene. A fellow up there by the name of John McCoy got a great idea. That if we trail the cattle up there, he'd get the railroads to build stockyards and pens that we could load them right up into the cars and ship them out of there. Well, he's done it. Now it's up to us to bring him the cattle. Well, that's just about what we're doing. I was lucky enough to meet an old fellow before we started here on this trip. He'd come down that trail with those government wagons. He'd been a teamster. Then he went up with one of the first trail herds that started up here. He told me some things about that are well worth remembering. One thing, in just a couple of days from now, we'll start to run into the Indian country. Now, he said it's all right when you get up in that Indian territory to go across Indian lands, but them fellas are going to come out there and they're going to demand tribute from you for every blasted trip and every trail herd that comes across here. And them Indians, they ain't a bit shy about asking for things. You'll see them come riding up here, a small war party of them, and Chief will sit on his horse there and he'll start talking signs to you. There's only one word they know. That's woha. That means beef. And he'll make a sign to you like that, just like them curved horns on a buffalo. Woha. That means beef. Then he'll say to you, you'll give me 10, 20, woha. Then you can cross our land. That's what that means. You can go across. But whittle him down. You got to bargain with him. Don't take his first offer. If he says 20, tell him you'll give him 3, and maybe you'll settle for 5. Because you're going to have the tab put on you every step of the way up there across that Indian country, and the first thing you know, you won't have a herd of cattle. That woha, funny enough, the Indians think that's English. It ain't English at all. You know, the first cattle they ever saw come out here was in the covered wagons. And they saw these critters drawing the covered wagons, and they looked like a buffalo, and that's the sign for the buffalo, so they said, that's sign for that fellow. So they could make the sign for our cattle, but they heard these fellows a cracking the whips and a hollering at them, hollering, whoa, and ha. So the Indian thinks that's the name for that critter. So he calls it woha. Now when a white man hears the Indian say that, he thinks that's an Indian word for beef. Woha. That's the way an Indian says it. But it ain't no such thing. There's nothing but good old English. Whoa and a ha. So just remember that. When they holler woha, that means you got to give them beef. Now get along with them fellas, because there's lots of territory you got to get through, and they're a help to you sometimes. Now when you get to some of them rivers, now you young fellas, I know a lot of you, you're good horsemen, you're old cavalry soldiers. You think that when you get to them rivers, well, you got 8 or 10 horses in your string, every one of you, and you want to ride your best horse across them rivers. Don't you do it. I'll tell you why. I know you've got some half-broke broncs, and you got some half-trained things in your string there. Get the craziest headed horse that you can possibly find, one that throws his head, throws himself over, humps his back and bucks with you, and that ain't got a lick of sense, and when you come to them river crossings, ride him. And I'll tell you why. Because you'll come out sometimes on a bed of quicksand. Now, a good, sensible horse, when he gets in that quicksand, he'd go kind of slow-like. But when he does, he's going to sink lower and lower and lower and lower. But that crazy-headed varmint, get on him, and the minute a foot sticks, he's going to throw himself rare and pitch, and he'll take you out of there just like greased lightning. Now, just remember that. Sounds crazy, but just remember I told you. And then he went on to tell me about some of the other things that we'd meet along the trail. He spoke of these river crossings. Now these critters that we've brought out of Texas are old moss-horn steers, a lot of them. Most of them have been running wild. They're afraid of a man. And now we've rounded them up, and we've put them in a trail herd, and we're starting them off. Another thing this old fellow told me about was, he said, you don't know much about the country, and you can't tell whether you're following a trail herd or not, or whether you're following a trail that a herd's gone over. It might have been a bunch of buffalo. So you're liable to get sheared off in the wrong direction. So when you come into camp at night, night's set down, the stars are out, Just take the pole of your wagon, just take that wagon tongue and point her straight toward the North Star. And then in the morning when you hitch up, you move out straight and you're headed north, and that's the right direction. Don't forget that. Now, them are some of the things that I want to tell you young fellas that are coming up that trail. Well, he told me a lot of other things, but I was interested particularly in what he had to tell me about those cattle. The way to handle them on the trail. It's a new business to all of us, boys. We've all got to learn it. I know a lot of you young fellas have been in the rebel cavalry, and you think when anything happens, you have to rear back and let a big squall out of you that's going to scare something. But don't scare the cattle. If you do these things that I've told you, and that this old-timer told me, you may live to tell your grandchildren that you took one of the first trail herds that ever went north over the Chisholm Trail.
Join us for another authentic story of the West when we again meet America's favorite Western storyteller, Tim McCoy.